All right. Well, welcome everybody to Verge Electrify. Today's conversation is going to be about lessons learned from the front lines of electric fleets. And I am so pleased to be joined by three of my colleagues here today to discuss sort of their different experiences and some best practices and some lessons learned. Most folks here probably already know the organizations that these folks hail from, but I'm gonna go around with a round of introductions, let you introduce yourself and your role. But then if you could also tell us a little something about your company, maybe something we didn't know already, especially if as it relates to transportation or your sustainability goals. And I'll just start at the top of my window, which is Megan.
Great to be here today and be joined by this fantastic panel and to have such great participation. So I'm Meghan Wyman. I'm Director of Transportation Electrification at Edison Energy. So Edison Energy is an advisory who works with organizations and clients as they're thinking about transportation electrification, all the way from really early feasibility planning all the way through to implementation. I think one thing that, one of the things that we talk about is cost, carbon, and complex choices. And I think that really just kind of just encapsulates really what this conversation is about with transportation electrification, and that that really holds true, and that, you're really trying to tell a carbon story. You're really trying to manage costs as well and understand what their return on investment is. But it's a really complex choice. This is fuel switching. It's a new energy source, and so that can be really a bundled decision. And so we really help organizations be able to navigate those decisions and how to really make electrification work for them. Do you want me to pass it to the next one? How about I pass it over to Laura as the next intro?
Sounds good.
Thanks, Megan. Well, I'm excited to be here. I'm Laura Confer. I'm our Director of Fleet and Facilities for Anheuser-Busch. So if you don't recognize the name, we're the proud brewers of Budweiser, Bud Light, and Michelob Ultra. And with Anheuser-Busch in particular, we actually have 4 main sustainability goals that we've been on public for 2025, all related to our water stewardship, smart agricultural, returnable packaging, and then lastly is kind of our renewables and carbon, in which one of those pieces is a 25% reduction within our carbon emissions through our entire value chain. And I think, an interesting fact specifically is transportation only actually makes up 9% of that full carbon emissions. And then only 20% of our, value chain is actually controlled within our own supply chain. So in order to achieve that full 25%, we actually have to work with our suppliers to see our full CO2 savings and commitments. And then I'll pass it over to Stephen.
Hello, so I'm Stephen Moelk. I am the project manager for IKEA's zero emission delivery ambitions here in the United States. And that is part of a larger global goal to provide zero emission home deliveries to all of our customers in all of our markets that we serve. We have hundreds of stores all over the world, 50 of them right here in the United States. And we do produce more renewable energy than we use today, which is a little fun fact about IKEA. And for me, specifically on the transportation side, we don't actually own any of the trucks that we're trying to electrify. So that's another little fun fact. It makes my job that much more complicated. But there you go, and I'll pass it back to Niki.
Thanks so much. And I'm very pleased to be here. My name is Niki Okuk, and I work with CALSTART. We primarily we're started here in California, but we are now nationwide, and we are a nonprofit and membership organization in the clean transportation sector, changing transportation for good. So I think that Megan started us off on a really interesting conversation about, making choices. It was not always obvious that electrification was going to be the way, but here we are. And so I wonder, when you're assessing some of the early challenges that you guys discussed and some of the trade-offs that are there, what are the factors that are going into setting your goals and making your first early decisions when considering making EV buying choices and recommending those for your customers? Again.
Sorry, was that for Nikki? I didn't hear the ending part.
Yes, for you.
Oh, great. Yeah, so I think that for a lot of organizations, and specifically those that we work with, they, it's often, it's a fuel switching exercise. So you're going from traditionally maybe a gas or a diesel fleet into electricity. And so like you're going from a very different fuel source into electrons and electricity, which can be very complex. And you're working with a different set of stakeholders. You're working with a utility, new technology, different type of vehicles. I think the first step often with making those decisions, it typically does come from some sort of sustainability or carbon goal. That's usually the driver. That's usually where there's buy-in. They're like, okay, great. We see the carbon picture. We see the sustainability story. This is helping us meet our targets around that. But then it gets into kind of the nuances of, okay, well, how do we make this work for us? It's a new technology. It's a new type of fueling. We not only have to think about vehicles, we have to think about now charging, electric vehicle charging, which is different. We also have to think about energy management and as it's termed, load management, which is a completely different type of way to think about fueling and also how it meets operational considerations. And so for many organizations, there's typically that organizational alignment around a carbon story. But then a lot of the questions that come into play is, how do we make this happen? How do we understand it more tangibly? And we work a lot around trying to make a business case for that, because and I think we'll talk about this in some later questions, because it's not only that it becomes a sustainability and a carbon picture, but it can also be a cost savings measure for a lot of organizations, and that it just becomes mutually beneficial when they think about electrification.
Great, thanks. I saw Laura nodding there. Does that sort of resonate with your experience at Anheuser-Busch and the transition you've been making there?
Yeah, I think Meghan hit on a lot of points that, there's a lot of different pieces at play. So within an organization, I think you need to have strategic alignment throughout all of your different departments, including both from the procurement side, senior leadership with your carbon goals, as well as she hinted at the operations side, which is where I sit and am on. And it's important to have everybody together and understanding what your KPI goals are and kind of putting those measures in place, and then understand how you get to them. But I think she hit on a great point there around that it doesn't have to be an expense. This can be really a cost savings initiative as well. And I think that's where partnering with different, grants, local communities, as well with other programs and so forth, can really help drive and identify savings, because we're all working for one goal, and just maximizing everyone's effort into the same outcome.
That's true. I wonder, I'd like to ask Stephen, do you believe that IKEA will find that overall the transportation electrification is a cost savings or cost benefit, or are there other benefits to electrification that you folks are realizing?
Well, I think the initial benefit, there's an initial cost. Obviously, we're at the kind of the first adopter stage here, but I do think the costs are going to come down. They're already starting to come down, right? And I think that the prevalence of public infrastructure and stuff like this will help that. And obviously, some of the big OEMs getting into the game will drive the costs for the vehicles down. So all of that's like a good thing. The real cost, I mean, I'm a trucking guy. I'm kind of new to the sustainability world, but the big cost, I suppose, is how you reroute the goods flow more than anything else, right? Because in the electrified world, the trucks are kind of tethered to this infrastructure, whereas before electrification, the trucks could be redeployed, at will anywhere. So it gives you a lot more flexibility. And I think that what we're seeing, particularly as long as the ranges remain relatively short, that and the infrastructure remains limited, that you're locking vehicles into a specific use, and therefore you don't have that same kind of like logistical flexibility that you had before. So that's really the cost. And I can't, at this stage we're finding it difficult to commingle our products with other people's products or share some of those assets that we had done previously, which really helps bring down costs. So whenever you have kind of a solution that's kind of built and tailored for your own purposes, then that's going to be probably the highest cost solution possible. So But to answer your question, long way of answering your question, is that I do think it's going to come down because ultimately more people are going to adopt zero emission vehicles, and we will be able to get back into, sharing those assets and sharing infrastructure and things like that.
Yeah, I wonder, what are some of the responses that you're getting from your subcontractors when you're broaching this topic with them? When you first bring to them this idea, are folks responsive? Scary a
Yeah,
little bit?
we're a big customer, so maybe that has something to do with it, right? Everybody wants to help out, so but I think there's a lot of uncertainty. To be fair, they look at this initially with, they want to help out, but they want to make sure that we have kind of an open dialogue, and we're going to work with them to help achieve this. We're going to be partners in this together. So I think that's super important that we all recognize that we're kind of learning along the way. But everybody's been, really supportive of this, and I think it's a good chance for them to at least try out, zero emission vehicles and zero emission delivery. Because while we may be the first customer asking for this, we're not going to be the last, right? So this is a good opportunity for them to kind of jump in and try it out. Because if they don't, the reality is, that more and more customers more and more big companies are making these goals, like Anheuser-Busch and others that have big sustainability goals out there. And if their vendors are not going to be able to step up to the plate to help them with that, then they're going to find their own solutions and kind of go around that. So they really need to step up. And so up to this point, I think everybody's been very supportive.
I remember one of the first anecdotes I heard was actually from a driver at Anheuser-Busch. So I'll go back to Laura with this question. It was wonderful to hear from an actual operator. I, like Steve, also come from trucking, having owned and operated vehicles myself. And one of the first things he said is, I love going home and not smelling like diesel.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'd love to hear more about, since you're in operations, how's it going there, and what are folks saying about the transition you've made thus far?
Yeah, I think from a driver perspective, we have been able to do some interviews after the deployment. So for those who might not be aware, we've actually deployed 25 BYD all electric assets within California across a variety of our locations. And I think, in some of the interviews we've done with the employees, they're incredibly proud, right, that they're driving a zero emissions in their own neighborhood that they're living in, right? So they're making less noise, less pollution, right, in the area that their kids are growing up. So they're very proud there. And I think the other benefit we've actually seen is customers find it, like very interesting, right? All of a sudden we see, the store owner or restaurant owners coming out, looking at the truck, interested in understanding, is that electric? Like, what's going on here? And they're engaging in those conversations with us, and saying like, it's neat that you guys are investing and kind of investing back into the community through zero emissions. So I think it's just been a really positive message as well, right? There's no smell on the driver and so forth. And it's a lot easier transition in our tier 2 fleets. So we do have two structures of fleet, to Stephen's point. One is being that longer haul fleet from our breweries to our wholesalers. And then where we've actually implemented our EV technology currently is in that urban market setting. So it is a little bit of a short haul, has shorter duty cycles and so forth, but we've seen, great success. They come back to their home location each evening and are able to charge with no problem and so forth. But yeah, that the drivers definitely love it and are very proud of driving a zero emissions.
I'll just say too, I rode in a few weeks ago, I rode in the Freightliner e-Cascadia, and I was sitting in the cab and it was so quiet and so zippy. And it was just like amazing how you could really have a conversation, and how much how quickly the acceleration was. And it was really truly amazing. Just like you expect such noise pollution along with, other particulates and nasty emissions along with those vehicles. It was just such a pleasure to ride in the cab of that vehicle. And two, like, I think the thing, to build on kind of what Laura was saying too, we're hearing from a lot of organizations as well, whether it's directly used for their operations or maybe it's some sort of customer benefit or ancillary benefit that actually their customers, for instance, like if they want to use electric vehicles as like a rental option for one for one organization, their customers are actually asking for it. And specifically in high propensity electric vehicle locations, that is actually a draw for the customers to come to that organization to have those electric vehicles. And so kind of building too on what Stephen was talking about with like incentives and other benefits is that if you're really strategic about how you're planning, maybe you have certain urban centers, certain geographies, it can also help to, not only build the customer case, but also in certain markets, there's vehicle incentives, there's utility incentives, there's also support from other organizations that can help ease some of that transition, that it doesn't necessarily, that you can have a more kind of phased rollout for your organization, that you can start in one certain geography and then expand as you're getting more learnings under the belt, more vehicles are being announced, and hopefully in the near future, more incentives for vehicles as well.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And I actually do want to sort of ask all of you what you think the types of sort of incentives and or policies. I know that cities are thinking very strategically about how they can become more attractive to these early deployments. So I'll start with you, Meghan, since you started the conversation. We here in California are familiar with quite a few incentives, including Carl Moyer and HVIP. But I'd be interested to hear of others or recommendations that you'd have to folks that are trying to design systems and policies for these fleets.
Yeah, I think that oftentimes, when organizations are right at the early stages, it's kind of like, oh gosh, well, how do we get started? Aren't electric vehicles really expensive? And you're right, for some of the Class 8s and the bigger vehicles, that upfront cost can seem pretty steep. But like you said, like in California, there are significant vehicle incentives that can almost offset the entire cost of the vehicle. So I would say that California is definitely a leader. They have been leading the market, and I think that a lot of organizations have started in California with their pilot programs just because of the policy alignment, the incentives, regulation that is making it just a more welcoming environment for electrification. But I'd say that there are a number of states that have also passed ZEV mandates, so zero emission vehicle mandates. I sit in Washington. We have a number of policies that have passed here. A lot of the New England states also have those. I know New Jersey has a significant medium and heavy duty vehicle rebate program as well. And so it's not only bundling that offset for the vehicles itself, that upfront cost. I think that a lot of organizations aren't aware with like all the utility programs that are out there. So a lot of utilities have charging infrastructure programs. So not only for the equipment itself, but also for all the enabling infrastructure. They sometimes cover almost the entire cost of that infrastructure. They might rebate the equipment itself. And so there ends up being quite a few incentives that can make that business case or that return on investment and offsetting that upfront cost a little bit more palatable to be able to actually consider those electrified vehicles.
So I'll ask the same question of Stephen. What do you folks take into consideration when you're looking at your next city or state location for deployment? Is there some suite of policies that makes for a good electrification ecosystem?
Yes, although we're not fixated on those policies necessarily, just because our goal is 100% zero emission home delivery. So that ends up being pretty clarifying for me. Whether a state has an incentive or doesn't have an incentive doesn't make any difference to me, because eventually, very shortly, I'm going to have to get to all the states anyway. So we're rolling out everywhere as soon as possible. So in terms of deciding the next city, it really has to do with what areas are easily serviced by the installation of the infrastructure where it happens to be. So for example, in cities that we don't have a store, that I have no real estate to actually put infrastructure, so that makes it kind of difficult. But in other cities where our store might be centrally located, or we have real estate centrally located and it happens to be close to our logistics provider, all of those types of things, play more into that decision-making process than maybe incentives do. That said, I have got plenty of opinions on incentives. They should, governments and should focus on giving zero-emission vehicles HOV access, bus lane access, toll reductions, all of that good stuff. The HVIP program in California is fantastic, of course. All these other states with VW funding, we find that extremely difficult to work with because of the scrappage requirements, and the utility incentives. While I think they're great and we're participating in a bunch of them, they do have, they're not harmonized, so it requires, lawyers looking at every single agreement, and a lot of them have different stipulations and things like this, like vehicle to charger ratios and things like that. So I would advise getting rid of all of that, keep your eyes on the prize of increasing EV adoption, and forget all these little nitpicky details, and focus on those types of things. And LCFS also helps in Washington State, where Meghan is, and California as well, because that's another huge driver of cost savings. So LCFS states are definitely big for us as well. So yeah, all of those things.
Sounds good. Laura, did you have anything you'd like to chime in on this topic?
Yeah, I think it really just starts with the infrastructure and making sure that you've identified where you have opportunities there. And one thing I think we haven't highlighted yet is it's not only the implementation of the EV vehicle, but then also where you're actually getting that power source from. So for example, within the 25 assets we deployed in California, we also installed a solar array, right? So that way you're not just zero emissions from the transportation standpoint, but you're powering also with a zero emissions solution. So I think again, working with all of the different partners you guys have talked about, working with the electric vehicle OEMs as well, they typically have very strong teams to help put together these business cases for you, as well as your local utility groups. That's where we've found our strongest, and we've found deployments in California as well as other opportunities across states. Just, again, looking to see where you have opportunity and then reaching out and partnering, for one solution.
So it sounds like we've covered some of the excellent benefits and great incentives and good outcomes, but let's go ahead and dig into some of the challenges. Meghan, if you were to flag for a company, just considering this, what are some of the things that you would advise early on?
Yeah, I think that there, oftentimes you need to have multiple things firing at the same time. So you're thinking about vehicles, you're thinking about charging, you're thinking about energy management, you're thinking about facilities planning. And I think that for some organizations, they realize that some of these things you don't want to do them sequentially. You want to do them in parallel because they can all take amount of time. Is that vehicle procurement might take amount of time depending on when it's being released. Charging infrastructure, depending on if there's any sort of utility upgrades that are required, that can take in a significant amount of time too, whether it's permitting or upgrades or anything like that, or coordinating with your utility, that can take some time too. And then it's also organizational readiness as well. You have to train workforce to be ready for new types of technology, charging, behavioral change, which is different as well. So I would say that there's a lot of tracks that you need to plan for when you're thinking about bringing vehicles online. And the more that you can once your vehicles are delivered and you have charging ready, whether you're using on-site facility charging or you're using maybe a public network, having that strategy ready before the vehicles arrived is a good thing. I would say that there are some probably dismal cases that are out there where I've heard of fleet managers who have vehicles arriving, but there's no charging there, and then the vehicles brick, and they're really disappointed. And then all of their operational and fleet managers are, oh gosh, this new technology is awful. And so you want to make sure that it's a positive experience for everyone, because because when it is when it's a well-planned process, folks really see the benefits that they're like, wow, this is a cleaner vehicle, it's quieter, it's fun to drive, and it can actually be an enjoyable experience. So I'd say really having that strategic planning and that roadmap and making sure that you have all the pieces that are working to make sure you have smooth operations is one of those key considerations. Oh, I think you're muted, Niki.
Muted.
Thank you. Back to you, Laura. I'd ask the same question, from your experience now, just the few that are out there on the road and the ones that are coming, what have you flagged now as the initial challenges that you always want to be looking out for and trying to tackle first?
So I think highlighting a few of Meghan's points there on having a positive experience as you go through is that initial planning. So making sure, again, that you have the right financing, in place with your team, as well as then the infrastructure, but also doing test drives. So that's something we implemented in, Anheuser-Busch, is that we would bring the vehicles on site, have them on site for, upwards of a week. They would get to take the vehicle out on route. They would get to have feedback. There were some things changed directly with the OEMs that we worked with. And I think that really had a sense of ownership, right? So that way, later when that, truck actually arrived at the facility, they felt that they had, significant input, right? And so it wasn't a burden or change. It was very exciting. But I think overall, like, as we look long term, it's the infrastructure that is ultimately probably the most challenging aspect of this. Is, we've already seen at a few of our locations that we're going to have a utility upgrade to continue to expand our fleet. And so it's working with our local utilities and the timelines. And those lead times are pretty significant. So it's just making sure we have the right plan in place for the next 3 to 5 years plus down the line, not just next year, because those timelines are so significant. That I would say is ultimately probably our biggest challenge.
Great. And there was actually a question in the chat for you, Laura, specifically about the solar, and to your point about infrastructure. Folks are wondering, as the energy from the solar, are you having on-site storage for that? Is this something to help with demand charges, or are you able to get that energy like directly into vehicles? Tell us a little bit more about that.
So our on-site solar array that we actually have installed, so there is not a battery storage process in place for it. It's simply to offset the batteries that we're utilizing. However, I would, ultimately have everyone look into different charger management solutions that are out there. They're significantly and rapidly changing as there's more EVs out on the market. So not only can you charge, at different times based off your duty cycles and understanding those to not have an impact on, your grid and your community, but there are future technologies coming out and companies trialing their equipment that you can actually help offset and provide power back, right? You could use your EV vehicles that you have as almost a stationary power plant for your grid during peak needs for your community. So, definitely I would look at all aspects as you go into EV. So not just the EV itself, but also that power management aspect, because there's a lot in there in itself.
We also have a question for Stephen, which has something to do with infrastructure as well, which is, you'd mentioned using your facilities for charging for your subcontractors, but it sounds like there's some challenges with routes and logistics. Are you moving in the direction of like overnight parking, DC fast charging? Is there a way that you charge for them? Do you own and operate the chargers yourself? It's sort of a string of questions of how does this work for trucks that don't belong to you charging at your site?
Right. Well, I mean, we went into this thinking that we're going to own these chargers, and then we're just going to put them on site and do depot charging and stuff, which sounds obvious, but it's not really when you consider none of the trucks were parking there overnight previously, right? So this is kind of a new arrangement. This is not necessarily the ideal scenario for us to be building out charging stations. We don't own gas stations today, but apparently we have to build out charging stations. But that is what we're doing. So we're building them in the only real estate we have available, which is our stores. But it's not necessarily the way that our goods flow today. Our goods generally, we outsource to third-party logistics carriers, and they use their own warehouses, just like you give a package to UPS and it goes into a UPS warehouse, right? So it goes to somebody else's warehouse. The problem is we can't install infrastructure at that facility, so we have to install it at ours, which means that you have to reroute the goods flow sometimes. And like Meghan was saying earlier, it's about organizational readiness, and we are, one example is we're changing the way, our Covina store. We're retrofitting our Covina store in LA to handle a lot more outbound flow. So we're putting in high-speed automated picking, and we're adding loading docks to the side of the store, because that store is, like a lot of our stores, a furniture store and not really a distribution point. And so we have to change the way that we're thinking about how the stores operate in order to kind of help facilitate some of this EV flow. So it is a long-term process, to kind of echo what Meghan and Laura were saying. And the infrastructure is just so important. And it's like an all-you-can-eat buffet of complexity, right? Like if you want to get into battery storage or renewables, you want to hook that up. You want vehicle to grid, like what Laura was talking about. I mean, you can really go deep into these subjects. The chargers themselves are relatively easy. It's kind of like a glorified extension cord. But then how you manage it, the software that manages it ends up being more important than the hardware. And then the different ownership models. Do you own them? Do you finance them? Does somebody else own them? Do you, is it charge as a service? There's a lot of different things out there, and you have to find the right one that fits your use case. So getting back to the types of chargers, we're using a combination of level 2 mostly for overnight charging, because our trucks are doing deliveries during the daytime when people are home, and then they have long dwell times at the depot. So we can get away with overnight charging when the electricity rates are lower, and slower charging for the trucks. So we eliminate demand spikes and so on, and of course cheaper equipment. We also, because if we had fast chargers, you need a valet out there, moving the trucks around with the fast charger. So there's that to consider. So there's a lot, but we're also deploying a few fast chargers where there's a lot of L2s, so that we can top off, or in case somebody didn't get a full charge, or in case we have to send a route back out for whatever reason. So it's really a combination with us. But you really have to find the chargers that kind of match your duty cycle, that complement that duty cycle, and get your organization ready to kind of handle that. So there's definitely a lot more planning, long-term planning involved in setting up something like that.
I think like from both of those, like the key takeaway is it depends. Like, is it, it's like, it depends. And like, you want to be able to meet your business operations, which is, kind of primary target is that you want to be able to meet what your customer needs are, or whatever your business's needs are. And then it's thinking about, okay, what do the vehicles work with that? What do the charging work with that? Can I be flexible at all in terms of like what my charging arrangement might be? Can I think about doing overnight depot charging rather than having to do maybe kind of like a milk run on route type of charging configuration? And then there's also, kind of like the point that Laura brought up too, there's also organizations that might want to do that, have DERs, have solar and storage paired with their charging solutions early, so that they can think about energy and load management early. There are those that, get the vehicles, get the chargers, and then they think about, solar and storage after the fact. And so there's kind of like, there's sort of like, you iterate, you learn, you kind of, you start to really create that flywheel of like, you pilot, and then it starts to build, and you see what works for your organization, how flexible you can be, and then maybe how you can derive some of those actual energy management benefits out of vehicles themselves. Because oftentimes when you do have that proactive load management and energy management around the vehicles, there can actually be some significant savings and cost savings, not only in terms of operations, but in how you manage your utility billing. And if you are able to kind of have parallel charging rather than all charging at the same time, there can be some significant savings that can really be optimized.
There's a couple questions in the chat that I think are probably best directed towards you, Meghan, which are sort of at opposite ends of the spectrum. One question is, what are your views on hydrogen, and how what the role is hydrogen can have in this, but also hybrids, plug-in hybrids specifically. Is there a place for them sort of in this mix that we're talking about?
Yeah, I think that a lot of that question too goes to kind of where folks are and where the vehicle availability is. I know that there's been a lot of excitement and buzz around hydrogen recently. And it likely makes sense for those larger vehicles, for those vehicles that are heavier, have longer, like long haul driving distances, where electrification might be more challenging. I would say though that for the hydrogen case, and just in terms of where we are in the market, vehicles and also just infrastructure capabilities, I would say electrification, electrons, the delivery of electricity is there already. I think that there is some development yet to go in terms of the vehicles and infrastructure to support hydrogen. Although I think that there is an interesting use case around, being able to have vehicles and be able to meet company needs, especially with those long haul use cases. I think that the same could be said for plug-in hybrids as well, as if you have longer driving distances where you might not be able to have, kind of charging consistently or be able to come back to depot for that charging. So I think that there is, for some of the smaller vehicles, medium duty vehicles, electrification, pure electrification would make more sense. But as it gets to those bigger, heavier, longer distances, that's where you might be looking at more of those kind of hybrid or alternative fuel options.
Great, thanks. I had a question actually about, now that we're rolling out sort of maybe our first, or in some cases our second generation, pilots and demonstrations with a lot of your companies. Maybe Laura, you could talk to us a little bit about, what's next. How does Anheuser-Busch envision taking this really to scale?
Yeah, so I mean, we're always looking at different opportunities and trialing a few different things this year. We also have different partners within, again, that longer tiered space, or tier 1, which is our long distance space, versus our urban market delivery. And I think if anyone is ultimately interested, as we make different public announcements and talk about our initiatives, you can visit our website at purposebrewing.com and learn more about our different implementations and solutions we've identified. But our overall, our corporate goal is a 25%, reduction in total carbon usage by 2025. So there's still, a large change that we're going to be going through here in the next couple of years, which is really exciting to be a part of personally. Our goal ultimately is 100% zero, emissions here, looking out into the future, but, just balancing all these challenges, right, and working through those to ultimately reach that goal.
Yeah, and you mentioned that only a certain segment of your transportation emissions were under your control. So what are some of your strategies, I think, for taking it to scale also with folks who don't work directly for you?
Yeah, so 100%. So again, we only actually control around 20% of our total carbon emissions within our supply chain. So when we look at our whole value chain, we're really proud of a program here within Anheuser-Busch that we've called Eclipse. And essentially it is a conference that we host, and 2/3 of all of our suppliers actually attend this conference. And we host, different sessions where they can learn from each other, sometimes competitors, believe it or not, right? And understand, what are you doing in the space to reduce your overall impact? But, we really have found that if everyone kind of comes together for the same mission, they can go further faster. And so, again, very excited with Eclipse, going into its 3rd year, and, and the impact we can make beyond, our own control with our external partners.
Yeah, and I'd ask Stephen the same question, because I know you folks are also exploring some different models for how to really take it to scale with suppliers and vehicles that may have shared or different forms of ownership.
That's right. I mean, as I said at the beginning, IKEA doesn't own trucks, and the third-party logistics companies that we outsource to, they don't own trucks either. Turns out that most of those trucks are owned by small contract carriers. In fact, 90% of commercial vehicles on the road are, according to the Department of Transportation, are owned by fleets of less than 5 vehicles, right? So it's most of these guys are going to be undercapitalized and are not ready to, and to be honest, shouldn't be taking the risk of getting into an early stage electric vehicle when just to meet commitments of a big company like IKEA. So from a lot of different points, we were kind of looking at an alternative ownership model. We decided on an EV rental model. So we're partnering with Fluid Truck in this case to put EV commercial delivery trucks out for rent for our contractor drivers. and then work with our logistics companies to make sure that those guys have the access to these trucks that they need without the kind of long-term financial entanglements that you get into with leasing or buying and things like this, because these vehicles are expensive, quite frankly. And there are a lot of question marks about residual value and things like this. And so the financing is really expensive. In most banks, you can't just walk into your Bank of America and get financing for a commercial electric commercial truck. So, we had to work around this this ownership model and work with a third party like Fluid to make sure that those trucks are available for rent. And then it's not required that those contractors use those trucks. If they show up one day with their own electric truck, bully for them. But in the meantime, these trucks are available and they're in the backyard there. So, go ahead, grab one, and let's go out and do this in a zero emission way. And so that's kind of what we're using to deploy the trucks.
Yeah, and I'd ask Megan a similar thing, so what are you sort of seeing out there as some of the new business models or new service models that you think might actually get us to scale, get us past this first round of deployments and into the bright electric future?
Yeah, I think for a lot of, kind of private sector organizations, they are just getting started. Like, Stephen and Laura are definitely trailblazers in the industry, but I think there's a lot of questions that are out there. And so to get to that next phase, I think there's definitely a learning curve that's gonna come with that. I thought it was interesting what Stephen was talking about, just like with, kind of fleet managers and also third-party ownership and financing. I think that's going to be a really interesting place too, because that will be kind of part of what's going to help to accelerate some of the movement in the market. I think there's also some interesting pieces too, where organizations, this might be a new area for them. This might be a new skill set. There could be that we talk about kind of this bundling. There could be some organizations that might have, a transportation electrification or a sustainable fleet group. I think that oftentimes when I've seen, more success stories, whether it's at a utility, whether it's at a government organization or even a private organization, when they have that prioritization on a sustainable fleet or transportation electrification, that typically really helps to put that priority, that expertise and that knowledge within the organization and make that a priority. And so that can really help to accelerate the journey too. And I think we might see too, just kind of structurally, or how this work kind of rolls out too, is that there might be more of these bundled electrification services. Right now we're talking about vehicles, there's also buildings, we're talking about, distributed energy resources, solar storage. I think that we're going to see more of that really help to move this journey and to move this market.
Thank you. So with just a couple minutes left here today, I would like to invite folks to put any questions you may have in the chat or the Q&A. I've seen a few bubbling up there. I also see that there is a survey that you've all been requested to take, and that survey is in the chat. So please click on that before you take off. But I'll go around and sort of let everybody get their last word in while I wait for a couple more questions. Stephen, is there any last word of advice you'd like to offer folks that are thinking about this?
Yes, two pieces of advice. The first one is to deploy right away. Just like Megan said, it's a iterative process, but you can't start the iteration without starting, right? So just get started. You'll see how it goes. And every little thing you pick up along the way is going to be super helpful. The second thing is get the power to your property, because that is in some areas that could be, you're on a waiting list for a year or more, and that's got to be, you have plenty of time to plan. Just get the power to the property. You can figure out the chargers and the trucks and all the other good stuff later, but if you're going to do utility upgrades, that's got to happen right away. So deploy.
Thank you. Laura, what about you?
Yeah, so I definitely would agree with Stephen there on the deploy aspect, but ultimately I think it's about making sure they have good internal alignment and strong KPIs and goals that you're going to set and achieve. because there will be some hurdles that you have to overcome. So having a clear focus and dream of where you're going to be heading is really important. And then with that, I can't emphasize again what Stephen said with the infrastructure is making sure you're looking at all the different options within infrastructure and getting ahead of that early and reviewing that often, right? As you continue to deploy, hopefully more and more and more, as you deploy your first round. But, I look at setting those goals and then ultimately your infrastructure as well.
Great, thank you. Megan, do you have any last words of wisdom for our audience today?
Yeah, I mean, I would just kind of, repeat some of the same things that were said. Start early, iterate, plan, develop your roadmap, think about where you want to go as an organization, get that internal alignment. But, you got to start somewhere, you got to test, make it small, make it targeted, and then just start to grow from there. And then I'd say lastly, also celebrate the successes. And I think that a lot based on, the number of folks that we have on this call, the excitement that's in the industry, celebrate it within your organization, really be able to tell the success stories, share those with other organizations, because the more that you can share those lessons learned and have others bought into it, I think it'll just only kind of just duplicate the effort or multiply the effort more and more. And so the more that you can be able to share that with your internal folks and externally, I think it'll only increase the effort.
Great, thank you so much. So for those of you who joined late, I'm here today with Laura Confer, who's Senior Director of Operations at Anheuser-Busch, Stephen Moelk, the Project Implementation Manager for IKEA, as well as Meghan Wyman, Director of Transportation Electrification at Edison Energy. I want to thank all of you guys for an excellent conversation and helping us understand the lessons learned from the front lines of electric fleets. So everybody have a great day and a great rest of your conference.
Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you very much.